She had spent 5 years becoming invisible inside her own marriage, and tonight the entire kingdom was about to remember her name. Stay until the end, because what happens at that ball will change everything you think you know about silence, power, and the moment a man realizes what he threw away. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings depicted are products of the imagination and bear no relation to real persons or actual events. The candle had burned down to its last half-inch before Vivian Ashford, Duchess of Ravenshire, finally set down her pen. Outside the tall windows of the East Library, the grounds stretched into November darkness. Skeletal oaks, frost-hardened gravel paths, the stone fountain that nobody had turned on since the summer 2 years prior when Cedric decided the sound irritated him during his correspondence hours. She had not argued. She had simply stopped listening for it. That was what 5 years in Ravenshire Hall had taught her. Not patience, exactly, something colder and more precise than patience. The art of selective deafness, the ability to remove herself so completely from a room that her own husband could look through her like a window. She capped the inkwell and pressed her palm flat against the page she'd just finished. A letter to Professor Alara Whitmore at the Athenaeum of Colesworth regarding the duchy's agricultural water rights and the legal precedent set in the Marchmont versus Duchy of Eller's ruling of 1847. The professor had written to her originally 3 years ago, by accident, believing her correspondence address belonged to the Duke's legal steward. By the time the mistake became apparent, Vivian had already drafted a response detailed enough that Whitmore simply kept writing to her. They had been exchanging letters ever since. Cedric did not know. The steward did not know. The household staff, who knew more than anyone suspected, had likely guessed but kept the information in that locked compartment that good servants maintained about the people who employed them. The East Library was Vivian's. Not officially, nothing in Ravenshire Hall was hers, officially, except the title that accompanied her husband's name and the rooms assigned to her by the household register. But the East Library had been abandoned for years before she arrived, its shelves clogged with legal volumes from Cedric's grandfather's tenure, and atlases of territories that had changed hands 3 times since the maps were drawn. Nobody came here. Not the housemaids who found it drafty and gloomy. Not the footman who had no reason. Not Cedric, who had a grander study on the west side of the estate, with a fire that his valet kept burning, and a desk that overlooked the formal gardens he'd planted to impress visiting dignitaries. She had colonized this room the way certain plants colonized forgotten walls, quietly, persistently, without announcement, taking root in the cracks until the structure itself began to accommodate her. She rose now and moved to the window, pressing her fingers against the glass. Cold radiated through it in slow waves. She could see her own reflection, that pale, composed face that guests sometimes called serene, and that she knew was simply the expression of a woman who had learned to keep her interior landscape behind a very particular wall. Dark hair pinned back with the kind of efficiency that suggested she hadn't thought about it, which meant she had thought about it precisely enough to make it look unconsidered. The dress she wore was one of her working dresses, soft gray wool, not the kind of thing the Duchess of Ravenshire was expected to appear in. But nobody was going to appear. Nobody ever came to the East Library. From somewhere in the main body of the house, 2 corridors away, beyond the green salon and the portrait gallery, she heard the low rumble of male voices. Cedric had guests. He had guests frequently. The West Wing of Ravenshire Hall functioned as an informal political salon 3 or 4 evenings a week. Lords and ministers and their retinues drinking Cedric's excellent wine and discussing Cedric's opinions on taxation reform and border treaties and the upcoming appointment to the High Judiciary. These gatherings were never communicated to Vivian in advance. She learned of them the same way she learned of most things in her own household, by observation, inference, and the particular set of Thomas the head butler's shoulders when he was organizing something he'd been told not to mention to the Duchess. She was not invited to these gatherings. She had not been invited to anything in this house in a very long time. The first year, she had tried. She remembered it now with the flat, unemotional recall of someone reviewing an old ledger. The entries clear, the emotion drained out by repetition and time. She had come down for his dinners with guests, and Cedric had looked at her with that expression she'd eventually cataloged as his default setting, where she was concerned, a kind of polite, weary tolerance, as though she were a piece of furniture he'd inherited and couldn't quite get rid of, but didn't know where to put. He introduced her correctly. He seated her appropriately. He spoke to her across the table when courtesy required it, in the brief, functional way of a man checking items off a list. Then he forgot about her for the remainder of the evening. The second year, she tried differently. She engaged his guests directly because if Cedric wasn't going to make her visible, she could make herself visible. She asked Lord Pemberton about his position on the Eastern tariff legislation and caught him sufficiently off guard that he gave her an actual answer instead of the pleasant deflection he'd been preparing. She corrected, once, a factual error that one of Cedric's advisors made regarding the duchy's revenue figures, gently, almost as an aside with all the social skills she possessed. She had known those figures were wrong because she had been reading the duchy's financial reports for the better part of 8 months, initially out of something that was half curiosity and half desperation for material that would keep her mind occupied, and then later with genuine absorption because the duchy's economic position was genuinely interesting in a way that Cedric's social conversation was not. After that dinner, Cedric had come to her sitting room, one of the rare occasions he came to her part of the house, and stood in the doorway with his coat still on, which meant he didn't intend to stay, and said, in that controlled, even voice of his that she'd learned to read the way you learn to read weather coming in from the north, "You corrected Hartley in front of Minister Voss." "Hartley was wrong," she said. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" He had looked at her for a moment, that long, assessing look that she'd once mistaken for consideration and had since learned was simply the habit of a man who needed to think carefully before he said anything, because he understood his own capacity for cruelty well enough to try to manage it. "These are my affairs," he said, "my guests, my conversations." He paused. "You don't need to involve yourself." She had said nothing. She had looked back at him with the expression she was already developing, the one that gave nothing away, and he had taken that for acceptance and left. She had cried later that night, which she recorded without judgment. She had been 23 and she had believed, not rationally, but in the way that young people believe things that nobody has explicitly told them, by absorption, by the accumulated weight of the stories they've been told, that marriage was a kind of arrival, that you got there and then you were somewhere, with someone, that the compound loneliness of being unpartnered in a world built for pairs would resolve when the pairing happened. What nobody had warned her was that you could be the most comprehensively alone of your life while sharing a name with someone, while sleeping under the same roof, while being seated correctly at the correct end of the table at the correct occasions where you were expected to appear. She stopped crying approximately 6 months after that, not because she made a decision to stop, but because at a certain point there was simply nothing left to cry about that she hadn't already cried about, and she was tired, and the East Library had good light in the mornings. She started reading instead. The voices from the West Wing had grown louder. She could distinguish Cedric's among them now, low, measured, the slight undertone of authority that he wore so naturally that she suspected he'd been born with it. The tone that made rooms adjust to him. She'd watched it happen dozens of times. Cedric entering a space and the space reorganizing itself around his presence without anyone deciding to do it, the way iron filings organize around a magnet. She had never been able to decide whether she resented that quality in him or simply cataloged it alongside everything else. He was, objectively, a remarkable man. She had no illusions about that. Competent, intelligent, possessed of a political instinct that bordered on prescience, capable of reading a room with the speed and accuracy of someone who had spent his entire life studying rooms. He ran the duchy with a precision that 3 generations of Ravensshire dukes before him had not managed, and he did it while also maintaining influence at court that men twice his age envied. He was not stupid. He was not, she had come to believe, essentially cruel, though he was capable of cruelty and sometimes exercised it with an efficiency that she found more disturbing than anger would have been. What he was, fundamentally, was absent. Present in every space he occupied and absent from every relationship he held. She had puzzled over this for years before she stopped puzzling and accepted it as a structural fact, the way you accept the structural fact of a drafty house. You seal what you can and you dress warmer. She turned from the window and looked at the letter she'd written to Professor Whitmore. Then she looked at the small stack beside it. Her notes on the Callsworth water rights case, A copy of the 1851 agricultural census data she'd requested from the Duchy Records Office, a monograph on irrigation technique that had arrived 2 weeks ago from the continent. She had been corresponding with 4 academics in different fields, assisting 2 local farmers in a dispute with an upstream mill, and quietly drafting a proposal for a women's educational endowment that she intended to submit to the Duchy's charitable trust under a pseudonym, because submitting it under her own name would result in Cedric hearing about it, and she had no interest in that conversation. Nobody in the main house knew about any of this. Or rather, Thomas probably knew, and Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, certainly knew something, and her personal maid Josie knew most of it and kept it all with a loyalty so unfussy and absolute that it sometimes made Vivian's chest ache. She gathered the papers and locked them in the cabinet where she kept her working files. She extinguished all but one candle. She stood for a moment in the diminished light and listened to the muffled sounds of male laughter filtering through 200 feet of stone corridor. Then she climbed the back stairs to her rooms and did not think about it anymore. The letter arrived from the royal court on a Thursday morning. Thomas brought it on a silver tray, which meant he'd intercepted it before the regular post reached the household sorting, which meant he'd recognized the seal, the royal household crest in deep red wax, the particular stamp of the Lord Chamberlain's office. He set it on the small table beside her morning tea with the expression of a man who has delivered news before and knows that the delivery is its own communication. The Duke received his correspondence an hour ago, Thomas said, which was his careful way of telling her that Cedric already knew. She opened it. The Grand Winter Ball. 7 weeks. The Royal Court of King Aldrich III, by tradition and by royal pleasure, invited His Grace Cedric Ashford, Duke of Ravenshire, and Her Grace Vivian Ashford, Duchess of Ravenshire, to attend. She set the letter down and drank her tea and looked out the window at the frost on the east garden. Her Grace Vivian Ashford, Duchess of Ravenshire. She was invited, specifically, by title and by name. Not as an addendum to her husband's invitation, not as the Duchess in the subordinate sense that noble correspondence sometimes implied. The Lord Chamberlain had written both names in the same line, which was a specific choice, because the Lord Chamberlain did not make accidental choices. She thought about this for several minutes. She thought about what it meant that she hadn't attended the winter ball in 4 years. The first year of their marriage she'd gone, nervous and quiet, and seated beside Cedric, who had spent most of the evening in conversation with political allies, and glanced at her twice, both times the polite checking the furniture expression. And after that she had developed a convenient seasonal indisposition that prevented her attendance, and Cedric had not argued, and the court had probably barely noticed the absence of a woman who had made so little impression in her single appearance. She picked up the letter again. Josie appeared in the doorway, having learned to materialize at precisely the moment she was needed. "Shall I begin drafting a reply, Your Grace?" "Yes," Vivian said. "Tell them I'll attend." Josie's expression did not change, but something in her stillness shifted, the way the air in a room shifts before weather turns. "The green rooms, I expect," Vivian said, meaning the dressmaker on Cavendish Lane, who had made 2 of her better working dresses, and who she'd never given real work to, real work being the kind of commission that required the dressmaker's full attention and the kind of budget that Vivian was, as Duchess, entitled to, but had never exercised. "I'll send word today," Josie said. "Don't mention the occasion to the household," Vivian said. "Not yet." She encountered Cedric that afternoon, which was unusual. He passed through the east corridor at 3 o'clock, and she was coming from the direction of the library with her arms full of documents, and he stopped because he almost walked into her, which had the practical effect of forcing them to acknowledge each other in the direct frontal way that they generally managed to avoid. He looked at the documents in her arms, then at her face, then at the documents again. "What is all of that?" he said. "Research," she said. A pause. He had the quality, she'd noticed it over years, of pauses that did specific things. This one was doing the thing where he was deciding whether to ask a follow-up question or let the answer stand as sufficient, and she could watch the calculation happen in the slight tension around his jaw. "The estate accounts are managed by Fenton," he said. "I know that," she said. "This isn't the estate accounts." "Then what is it?" She shifted the documents in her arms. They were heavy, and she was not going to ask him to hold any of them. Correspondence with the Athenaeum of Colesworth, and some materials related to a water rights matter in the Lower Duchy. He looked at her. The pause this time was doing something different, not calculation, but something that might, in a different man, have been surprise. You're involved in a water rights matter. I'm advising in a limited capacity, she said. 2 tenant farmers on the southern edge of the Halmer property. They've had a dispute with an upstream mill operation for about 18 months. I've been looking at the relevant legal precedent. Why didn't you go through Fenton, he said, or through my legal office? Because they didn't come to your legal office, she said. They wrote to me. He processed this. She had time to note the exact quality of his processing. The way his face went very still, not the blank stillness of a man who wasn't thinking, but the contained stillness of a man who was thinking about a great many things at once and had long practice at not letting any of them show. And you've been, he said, and then stopped, and then said, how long? About a year, she said, for this particular matter. A year, he repeated. The case moves slowly. There are 17 relevant precedents, and the property survey records are incomplete going back to 1808. He looked at her. There was something in that look that she couldn't immediately catalog, which was unusual because she had cataloged most of his looks years ago. It wasn't the furniture assessment expression. It wasn't the controlled cruelty expression. It wasn't the political calculation expression. It was something older and less managed than all of those, something that surfaced and then was immediately suppressed, driven back down behind the wall he kept around himself. But she caught the edge of it. Vivian, he said, and the use of her name, he rarely used her name, she'd noticed, she didn't know if he'd noticed, landed oddly. I'm going to be late to a meeting, she said, which wasn't true but functioned adequately as an exit. She moved past him and went to the East Library and stood inside the doorway for a moment after she'd closed the door, breathing. The use of her name. That was all. She set down the documents and went back to work. The dressmaker's name was Madame Colette Arden, and she was a small, sharp-eyed woman of approximately 60 who had built her reputation over 30 years on the principle that women deserved to be dressed as the people they actually were, rather than the people their husbands or fathers or the current fashion dictated they should be. She addressed 3 countesses, 1 former queen's lady-in-waiting, and any number of women who came to her in the early stages of becoming someone and left, 6 months later, fully arrived. She received Vivian in a back fitting room that smelled of beeswax and cedar, and the particular fabric sizing that serious seamstresses used, and she looked at Vivian for a long time without speaking, not the measuring look of commerce, but the assessing look of a craftsperson identifying her material. And then she said, You haven't been here in some time. No, Vivian said. The Winter Commission, Madame Arden said, making it a statement rather than a question. The Grand Winter Ball. A beat. Madame Arden looked at her again with that measuring quality. I see, she said, and from her it meant something specific. Not acknowledgement, but understanding. The understanding of a woman who had dressed enough women walking into rooms designed to diminish them to recognize exactly what this moment was. I don't want to look like a duchess, Vivian said. Or rather, I want to look like what a duchess is, not what people expect one to look like. Those are very different things, Madame Arden said. Yes, Vivian said. That's the point. They spent 2 hours in that room. Madame Arden made notes and took measurements and brought out fabrics in colors that Vivian had never worn. Deep jewel tones, midnight blues, one extraordinary deep burgundy that caught the lamplight and turned it to something close to fire. She spoke very little and listened a great deal, and when she finally said what she intended to build, Vivian felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a feeling so specific and so long absent that it took her a moment to identify it. She felt like herself. The weeks between the dressmakers and the ball operated on a schedule that Vivian kept to herself. She continued her correspondence. She continued the water rights case. She made progress on the educational endowment proposal. She exercised in the early mornings in the east garden before the household stirred, walking the perimeter paths in the cold with a pace that was less exercise than thinking with a body, working problems through the rhythm of movement. Cedric she saw occasionally in the managed, glancing way of two people sharing a very large building. He looked at her sometimes with that unidentifiable expression and then looked away. She observed this without assigning meaning to it. She had learned over years the danger of assigning meaning to Cedric's expressions. She had done it early in their marriage, had read consideration into his silences and interest into his looks, and had built small private architectures of hope out of things that had turned out to be nothing, and then those architectures had collapsed, and the rubble had been harder to live around than the absence of hope had been. So she observed, and she did not assign. She noted it the way she noted the weather. 3 weeks before the ball, Josie brought the finished gown. It arrived packed in layers of white paper in a flat box that smelled of cedar. Josie unpacked it with the focused care of someone handling something precious and held it up in the afternoon light from the west windows of Vivian's dressing room, and they both stood for a moment and looked at it. The color was the midnight blue, deeper than navy, almost black in shadow, but alive with a dark warmth when light hit the fabric directly. The cut was architecturally precise, the kind of construction that looked simple until you understood how much engineering that simplicity required. The neckline was correct without being dramatic. The sleeves, the fall of the skirt, the way the back moved. Madame Ardennes had built something that would move with its wearer and not against her, which was rarer than it should have been. Josie, who was not demonstrative, made a small sound in the back of her throat. "Yes," Vivian said. She did not try it on that day. She had the unsuperstitious, practical woman's version of superstition, the sense that certain things should be held in reserve for their correct moment. She let Josie put it back in the paper and set it in the wardrobe, and she went back to her water rights documents, and she did not think about it. Or she thought about it the way you think about things you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for them. In the peripheral way, the hovering background presence, the thing that's there every time you turn, but you've learned not to look at directly. The night before the ball, Cedric came to her sitting room. This was, in the full 5 years of their marriage, approximately the 7th time he had done this voluntarily, not counting the first year when he had made occasional appearances that she now recognized had been attempts at something he either didn't know how to sustain or had talked himself out of. She could have told you the date and approximate circumstance of each prior visit. The territory of Cedric's appearances in her rooms was charted with the precision of someone mapping scarce water sources. He knocked, which he didn't always do. She was at the writing desk with the lamp turned low, making final notes on the water rights brief she intended to submit to the relevant magistrate's office the following week, and she looked up when the knock came and said, "Come in," with the neutral, controlled voice she used for most things. He came in and stood in the middle of the room in a way that didn't quite commit to being there, the way he sometimes stood in spaces as though reserving the right to leave them. "I understand you've accepted the invitation to the winter ball," he said. "Yes," she said. "I wasn't informed." "No," she agreed. "You weren't." He looked at her. She kept her expression pleasant and unreadable and waited. "You haven't attended in 4 years," he said. "I'm aware of that." "Why now?" She set down her pen and turned in her chair to face him more directly, which was a choice, and she made it deliberately. "Because I was invited," she said, "specifically, by name." "You're the Duchess. You're always invited." "I'm the Duchess," she said. "By name Cedric. The Lord Chamberlain wrote both our names. That's not the same as being the Duke's addendum." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the oaks, November, getting toward December, the kind of cold that settled into old stone and stayed. "You'll need," he began. "I have what I need," she said. Another pause. This one was different from the others she had catalogued. Not calculation, not suppression, but something that she would, if she were less careful than she'd trained herself to be, describe as discomfort. Cedric Ravenshire was not a man who experienced visible discomfort. The fact of its presence, however briefly, was more data than she'd collected in a year of occasional corridor encounters. "I don't want this to be," he started again, and stopped again, and she watched him with the steady, patient attention of someone who had learned to wait. "To be what?" she said, when it became clear he wouldn't finish on his own. "Complicated," he said. She looked at him. She let the moment sit. "It's a ball," she said. "I'll attend. I'll be appropriate. I'll behave exactly as a Duchess of Ravenshire ought to behave." She picked up her pen again. "I don't know what you're concerned about." He stood there for another 3 seconds. She counted, because she counted things. It was one of the habits she'd developed without meaning to, the habit of measurement. And then he nodded, once, and left. She heard his footsteps going back down the corridor toward the west wing. She set down the pen and pressed her palm flat on the desk and sat very still. "I don't know what you're concerned about." She knew exactly what he was concerned about. She'd known for a long time. The precise nature of Cedric's concern had come into focus in that East Corridor conversation 3 weeks ago, when he'd said her name and then looked away. And she had filed that information with the same clinical precision she filed everything. Not because she was hard, but because she had learned that the survival of the self required a certain forensic relationship with one's own feelings. You could feel them. You just couldn't let them navigate. Tomorrow she would put on the midnight blue dress and walk into the grand winter ball of the royal court of King Aldrich III. She would be announced correctly, by title and by name. She would enter a room full of people who had spent 5 years developing the vague impression that Cedric Ravenshire had a wife somewhere who kept to herself and lacked distinguishing characteristics. And every single thing she had become in the years they had assumed she was nobody. The breadth of her learning, the precision of her thinking, the specific quality of her presence that she had cultivated in solitude the way plants cultivate toward light. Every bit of it was going to be in that room with her. She didn't know what was going to happen. She knew that something was. The morning of the ball arrived with the clarity that cold weather gives to December mornings, the kind of bright cut-glass light that made the frost on the east garden look like sugar and gave the old stone of Ravenshire Hall a sharpness it didn't have in warmer months. Vivian was already dressed and composed when Josie brought her the morning's correspondence, and among the letters, one from Professor Whitmore, one from the magistrate's office acknowledging receipt of the preliminary water rights documents, there was a note, unsealed, on Ravenshire Estate stationery. She recognized the handwriting. She'd seen it exactly twice before in 5 years. Once on the household management schedule he'd sent to her rooms in their first year, once on a brief notification about an estate matter that affected the East Garden. His handwriting was what you'd expect, controlled, precise, each letter the correct height and the correct distance from the next, with a slight lean to the right that suggested the suppressed instinct of someone who'd been trained to write correctly and still carried the original impulse. The note said, "The carriage departs at 6. If you require additional staff for the evening, inform Thomas." She looked at it for a moment. "If you require additional staff, 5 years. Not, I'll see you downstairs. Not, I look forward to attending with you. If you require additional staff." She set the note down and went to her wardrobe. Josie helped her dress without conversation, which was one of Josie's gifts. The ability to read the emotional weather of a room and adjust her behavior accordingly, her presence becoming exactly as much or as little as was needed. The midnight blue went on correctly. The fastenings, the arrangement of the hair, the few pieces of jewelry she'd chosen, deep sapphires that had belonged to her mother. Nothing from the Ravenshire collection, because the Ravenshire collection had never felt like hers, and tonight that distinction mattered. She stood in front of the long mirror in her dressing room. She looked for a long moment. The woman who looked back at her was not the woman who had arrived at Ravenshire Hall 5 years ago. That younger woman, nervous and hoping, who had spent her wedding night in this same room listening to the quiet of a house that was going to be, she was only beginning to understand, extremely and specifically quiet. That woman had still been waiting for rescue from the wrong direction, still believing that what she needed would come from outside. This woman had built her own scaffolding, piece by piece, in a drafty library, in pre-dawn garden walks, in letters to academics who'd written to her by accident and kept writing back on purpose. She had become someone in a house where nobody was watching, which was, as it turned out, exactly the condition under which you found out who you actually were. "Your Grace," Josie said softly. "Yes," Vivian said. "Let's go." She came down the main staircase at 5 minutes to 6. Cedric was in the entry hall. He was dressed in his formal court attire, The deep charcoal of Ravenshire's house colors, the decorations of his rank worn with the ease of a man who'd been wearing them since he was 24. And he was giving instructions to Thomas about something, and he heard her on the stairs and turned. He stopped talking. Thomas, whose discretion was an architectural feature of his personality, found something to examine in the middle distance. Cedric looked at her. Not the furniture look, not the calculation look. Something she had no prior entry for in her catalog. Something raw and immediate that he controlled within a second, pulled back behind the wall, smoothed over, but a second was enough. She came down the remaining stairs and stopped at the appropriate distance. "You look well," he said. His voice was the even, managed voice, but there was a flatness under it that she recognized from a different direction than usual. Not the flatness of disinterest, but the flatness of a man exercising control over something that would prefer to move. "Thank you," she said. He offered his arm for the walk to the carriage. This was formality, correct procedure for the Duchess and Duke of Ravenshire departing for a court function. She took it. His arm under hers was solid and warm through the fabric, and she focused on the door ahead of them and not on that. The carriage was waiting. They were handed in. The door closed. The horses moved. In the dark interior of the carriage, with the lights of Ravenshire Hall receding behind them and the road opening ahead toward the city, Vivian looked out the window at the winter dark and thought about nothing at all. Beside her, Cedric was also silent. In 5 years, they had perfected the art of silence that carries nothing. Not the comfortable silence of familiarity, but the managed silence of two people who have learned to occupy the same air without disturbance. But something tonight was different in that silence, and she couldn't yet put her finger on what it was. She felt it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before weather arrives. She looked out the window. The lights of the city were beginning to appear, distant at first, then accumulating. The Capitol building toward its winter brightness. Somewhere ahead was the royal palace, already lit from every window, the crystal spires catching the light and throwing it back in fragments, and inside, several hundred of the most powerful people in the kingdom were assembling for a ball. And in 8 hours, something was going to happen that neither of them had prepared for. She didn't know what it would cost her. She didn't know yet whether she cared. They arrived at the palace at 6:30. The entry procession took 20 minutes, carriages queued along the grand approach, footmen in the royal household livery moving efficiently, the assembled guests processing through the entrance in order of precedence. She and Cedric were announced at the top of the grand staircase in the correct order: His Grace Cedric Ashford, Duke of Ravenshire, and Her Grace Vivian Ashford, Duchess of Ravenshire. She heard it clearly, her name in the announcer's clear formal voice ringing across the entry hall, and she walked down the staircase beside her husband into a room full of candlelight and silk and power. And she felt something that she recognized, finally, after a long time of not feeling it. She felt ready. The ballroom was everything the royal court did correctly. Enormous, impossibly lit, the chandelier suspended from a ceiling painted 3 generations ago, with scenes of the kingdom's founding, warm light falling on 300 people in their finest, and the air heavy with the smell of flowers and beeswax, and the particular expensive fragrance of assembled wealth. She stood beside Cedric for the first 10 minutes of the arrival period, the correct behavior, the appropriate positioning. He was already speaking to Lord Alderton, one of his political allies, the conversation pulling him naturally in the direction of the cluster of men who constituted his court world. She watched this happen with the familiarity of someone who'd watched it happen before, in this room, 5 years ago, the first and last time she'd been here. She did not follow him. She turned instead toward the room. She moved into it with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who knew where she was going, even if nobody watching could have told them where that was. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman. She spoke to Lady Pemberton, who she'd met twice, and who was sharp and kind and surprised, pleasantly, to find herself in a conversation that required her to actually think. She spoke to a younger woman she didn't recognize, who turned out to be the new wife of the Viscount of Halmer, the same Halmer whose upstream mill was currently in dispute with her tenant farmers, and she managed that conversation with a particular care, genuinely liking the young woman and being scrupulous about compartmentalizing the professional matter. She moved through the room. She listened. She asked questions that people rarely got asked, the kind that required them to articulate their actual opinions rather than their performed positions, and she watched faces open with the particular pleasure of being actually heard. An hour into the evening, she realized something. People were coming to find her. Not performing the social obligation of acknowledging the Duchess of Ravenshire, coming to where she was and continuing conversations that had started to matter. She was, in the vocabulary of rooms like this, being noticed. She was aware, at the edge of her awareness, that Cedric was somewhere in the room. She did not look for him. She didn't need to. And then the music for the first formal dance set began, and the room reorganized itself, and through the shifting of people she found herself facing Crown Prince Adrian Vale. She had seen him before at a distance. Everyone in the kingdom had seen him at distances. He was the king's eldest son and heir, 30 years old, and carrying it with an ease that suggested he'd made some kind of peace with his position that many men in his situation never managed. He was taller than she'd registered at distance, with the kind of face that was interesting rather than conventionally handsome, sharp at the angles and warm in the eyes, and he was looking at her now with the direct, unperformed attention of someone who had decided to dispense with preamble. "Duchess Ravenshire," he said. "Your Royal Highness," she said. He smiled, a quick, unguarded thing that arrived before the controlled version could replace it. "Lord Pemberton's wife told me that you spent 20 minutes explaining the Marchmont agricultural precedent to her, and that it was the most interesting conversation she's had at one of these functions in 3 years." "Lord Pemberton's wife is very intelligent," Vivian said. "She didn't need explanation so much as a willing recipient for opinions she'd already formed." "I understand," he said, "that you're also managing a water rights dispute in the Lower Duchy." She looked at him. "That's a rather specific piece of information for a crown prince to have." "My office oversees the magistrate's records when regional matters reach a certain threshold," he said. "Yours came across my desk last week. The preliminary brief was excellent." A pause. "I also noticed it was submitted under the name V. Ashford." "The Duchy's standard document format," she said evenly. "Of course," he said, and the quality of his agreement made it clear that he didn't believe that, and that he respected the precision of her deflection. He held out his hand. "Would you do me the honor, Duchess?" The first formal dance. The Crown Prince, in the full ballroom of the royal court, with 300 pairs of eyes that were already, she could feel it, beginning to orient in their direction. She took his hand, and across the room, from somewhere in the cluster of political conversation near the east windows, she felt. She did not look. She did not need to look, but she felt. The precise moment when Cedric Ravenshire's attention found her. The music began. She danced. And something in the room, in the air of it, in the specific and irreversible quality of the moment, shifted like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for a very long time. She didn't know yet what door it was opening. She was about to find out. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings depicted are products of the imagination and bear no relation to real persons or actual events. The music was a waltz, which meant 3 beats to the bar and the Crown Prince's hand at the small of her back, and the entire ballroom of the royal court of King Aldrich III, adjusting its collective attention the way a field of grass adjusts to wind, all at once, all in the same direction, without any single blade deciding to move. Vivian felt it happen, the precise moment the room noticed. Adrian Vale danced the way he did most things, apparently, with a relaxed competence that suggested he'd mastered the form early enough that it had become unconscious, leaving him free to actually be present in the doing of it. He held her correctly, not too close for formality, close enough to speak without being overheard by the nearest couples, and he was looking at her with that direct, unperformed attention she'd registered at the introduction. "You've been away from court for some time," he said. Not an accusation. A fact, offered neutrally, waiting to see what she'd do with it. 4 years, she said. People notice the absence. I doubt that. Then you've been misinformed about what people notice. He turned them smoothly through the corner of the floor, and she caught, in the periphery of that turn, the faces of the assembled guests. Lady Alderton, with her hand raised to her neighbor's ear, Lord Pemberton watching over his champagne glass with the alert stillness of a man recalculating, the younger women near the column to the left who had stopped pretending not to look. "What brought you back?" "An invitation," she said. "By name." "Those arrive every year." "I know," she said. He was quiet for 2 bars of music, which she understood was him thinking rather than searching for words. A distinction she'd learned to make with men who used silence the way Adrian Vale apparently used it, as a tool rather than a gap. "The water right's brief," he said. "You've been working on it for a year." 14 months. "The mill operation has 2 senior partners with standing connections to the Duchy of Marchwater." A pause. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not. You submitted it anyway." "The farmers are correct," she said. "The law supports their position. The connections of the opposing party are irrelevant to the legal merits." He looked at her. The expression on his face was something she didn't have a category for yet, because she hadn't spent enough time in proximity to Adrian Vale to have built one, but it registered somewhere in the territory between respect and something sharper than that, something that was trying to figure out how it hadn't encountered her before. "Duchess Ravenshire," he said, "I owe you an apology on behalf of this court." She waited. "We should have been paying attention," he said. The music resolved into its final phrase and the dance ended, and he bowed with the precise courtesy of his rank, and she curtsied with the precise courtesy of hers, and when she straightened, he was still looking at her with that expression that she was going to have to build a category for eventually, and around them the applause for the orchestra broke whatever spell the 2-minute conversation had cast, and the ballroom became itself again, loud, bright, moving, except that it wasn't quite what it had been before. She could feel that. Cedric had not moved from the east side of the room. She knew this the way you know things you've been tracking without admitting you're tracking them. The peripheral awareness that had kept tabs on his location since they'd entered, the same way a body tracks weather. Not conscious effort, but something older and more automatic than that. He was with Lord Alderton and 2 other men she recognized as members of the High Council, and the conversation had the posture of serious politics, backs slightly curved toward the center of the group, voices low, the body language of men discussing things they didn't want the room to hear. But his head had turned. She caught it in the same moment she accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a footman and redirected her attention to Lady Whitford, who was approaching with the determined expression of a woman who had something to say and had been working up to it for 20 minutes. She let the awareness of Cedric's turned head register and then filed it without comment and gave Lady Whitford her full attention. "You danced with the Crown Prince," Lady Whitford said. She was 50, direct, the wife of a senior minister, and she stated things the way certain experienced women stated things, without preamble, the preamble having been identified as inefficient decades ago. "He asked," Vivian said. "He hasn't danced the first set with anyone but family in 3 seasons. "Then I'm honored," Vivian said, and meant it without performing it, which she could tell Lady Whitford registered. "You look different," Lady Whitford said. She was studying Vivian with the frank assessment of someone who had known her slightly from the single prior ball and was comparing the versions. "Not the dress. Something else." 4 years is a long time," Vivian said. "It is," Lady Whitford agreed. She sipped her champagne and looked out at the room with the expression of someone who had watched enough of these evenings to see the machinery underneath them. "Your husband is watching you." Vivian looked at her glass. "He looks at many things." "Not the way he's looking at this," Lady Whitford said, and moved on with the efficiency of a woman who knew when she'd delivered what she came to deliver. Bob. The evening organized itself the way evenings at court organized themselves, in layers, the public surface of music and dancing, and the correct social performances, and underneath it the actual work of the room, the alliances being confirmed, and the intelligence being gathered, and the power being measured in the particular currency of attention. Vivian moved through both layers. She was good at it, she discovered, better than she'd expected, which meant she'd been building the skills for it in the East Library without knowing that was what she was doing. The reading, the correspondence, the water rights case, the educational endowment, the 14 months of slow, careful work on a problem that mattered to people who had no other advocate. All of it had given her something to stand in. not performance. Substance. The difference was visible, she was learning, in rooms like this. People who had substance moved through parties differently than people who were only performing at having it. She spoke to 3 more people of consequence. She listened to a 4th who nobody else was listening to, a younger lord from the northern provinces who had strong and well-reasoned opinions about irrigation infrastructure and who looked faintly stunned when she asked a follow-up question that demonstrated she'd actually absorbed what he'd said. And then she looked up and found Cedric 6 feet away. He was not technically approaching her. He was standing at the edge of a natural break in his previous conversation, with Lord Alderton now absorbed in the orbit of a different cluster, and the 6 feet between them was the result of the room's reorganization rather than any intentional movement on his part. But he was looking at her with the expression that she didn't have a prior category for and was now being forced to build one for in real time, and the 6 feet had the quality of a threshold. "You know the Lord from North Vale," he said. It wasn't a question. "We've just met," she said. "You were talking about irrigation." "He has a proposal for the northern provinces that deserves attention," she said. "The infrastructure gap between the North and the Central Duchy territories is significant. It affects productivity in ways that show up in the tax records." He was looking at her. "You read the tax records?" "I read most of the Duchy's economic documentation," she said. "I've had time." Something moved across his face, fast, pressured, gone before she could fully read it. He took half a step and then stopped, as though something had interrupted the decision partway through. "Vivian," he said. She waited. "The Crown Prince," he said. "You know him." "I met him this evening," she said, "for the first time." "He danced the first set with you?" "Yes." "That's—" He stopped. His jaw was doing the thing she'd observed over years, the slight tension at the hinge that meant he was managing something he hadn't expected to need to manage. "That's not a small thing, in this context." "I know what it means in this context," she said. "Then you know that people will draw conclusions." She looked at him with the steady, even gaze she'd perfected over 5 years of having nothing to do with it, but perfect it. "What conclusions concern you?" He was silent for a moment. Around them, the room continued its business. Music, conversation, the clink of crystal, a burst of laughter from somewhere near the doors. In the middle of all that ambient noise, Cedric Ravenshire stood very still. "You're my wife," he said. It landed in the air between them and stayed there. She held her champagne glass and looked at him and let the sentence be exactly what it was. All 3 words of it, the specific weight of each one, the thing it said, and the much larger thing it didn't say. And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was a kind of cold, clear anger that had none of the heat of the early years' hurt in it, none of the desperation. This was something refined by time into a precision instrument. "Yes," she said. "I am." She turned and went to join a conversation across the room. What? The anger walked with her. She felt it in her sternum, in the controlled pace of her breathing, in the exact measured pressure of her fingers around the stem of the champagne glass. She did not let it reach her face. "You're my wife. 5 years of managed absence. 5 years of if you require additional staff, and you don't need to involve yourself in the furniture assessment look. 5 years of a man so committed to his own interior fortification that he had walled out the person who shared his name and his roof and his consequence and every practical element of his life. And what he reached for tonight, in a ballroom full of people where the machinery of observation was running at full capacity, what he reached for was possession. Not, I should have paid attention. Not, I didn't know you. Not any of the 100 things that 5 years of honest silence might have earned. You're my wife. As though that were a fact about her rather than a failure of his. She smiled at something the woman in front of her said, and made a response that was contextually correct, and filed the anger in the same place she filed everything. Not discarded, not suppressed, but stored with the precision of someone who knew she was going to need it later, and wanted it to be in good condition when the time came. Hotet. Adrian Vale found her again near the long windows at the north end of the ballroom, 40 minutes after the first dance, in the way that suggested the finding was not entirely accidental. He had a glass of something amber, and he looked at her with the expression that she was building the category for, and he said, "Lord Fenwick just told me that you've been conducting independent legal research for the past 3 years without anyone in the duchy's official administrative structure being aware of it." "Lord Fenwick overstates," she said. "Lord Fenwick is a man who understates as a professional practice," Adrian said. "So I'm inclined to take his overstating at roughly accurate value." He looked out the window at the winter dark beyond the glass, the palace gardens lit with lanterns, the city visible beyond them, the black cold sky above everything. "I want to ask you something directly." "All right," she said. "The educational endowment proposal submitted to the Duchy Charitable Trust last month, under the name of a V. Whitmore of Colesworth." He turned to look at her. "That's Professor Alara Whitmore's address. But the legal analysis in the submission doesn't read like an academic's work. It reads like someone who has spent time in the Duchy's actual records." She held his gaze. "That would be a very specific set of documents for a crown prince to be familiar with." "My office reviews charitable trust submissions that implicate Duchy finances over a certain threshold." He smiled slightly. "It was a very good proposal." "If it was approved," she said carefully, "I think the Duchy would benefit." "I think the Duchy would benefit from a great number of things it doesn't currently have," he said, "including apparently someone who's been operating as an informal legal researcher, agricultural advisor, and educational reformer from the East Wing of Ravenshire Hall for the past several years without receiving a single line of acknowledgement for any of it." She was quiet. "Duchess Ravenshire," he said, and his voice had dropped into something that was no longer court function register, something more direct than that. "I mean this plainly. The work you've been doing is significant. It deserves to be visible. You deserve to be visible." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the East Library and the candles burning down and the letters from Professor Whitmore and the farmers who had written to her because they had nobody else to write to. She thought about the note this morning in Cedric's controlled handwriting. "If you require additional staff." "Thank you," she said. Not performed, not deflected. Just the 2 words, carrying everything she meant by them. "There are people in this room," Adrian said quietly, "who would benefit from knowing what you're capable of. With your permission, I'd like to introduce you to a few of them. Not as the Duchess of Ravenshire." He paused. "As yourself." She understood what he was offering. Not a rescue, not a patronage, something more specific and more dangerous than either of those. Visibility, on her own terms. In a room where visibility was currency and she had been running a deficit for 5 years. "Yes," she said. And from across the ballroom she felt it again. The specific pressure of Cedric's attention, a heat she could register without looking, without wanting to register it. She didn't look. She went with Adrian Vale to meet the people who were about to learn her name. Kit. She was in the middle of a conversation with Minister Calvert and his wife about the proposed legislative changes to property rights for women of the landed gentry when she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, but the room had one of those sudden pockets of quiet that large rooms sometimes develop. A brief interval where several conversations ended simultaneously and the music paused between pieces. And in that pocket she heard Lord Alderton say to the man beside him, clearly enough to carry, "Remarkable woman. Ravenshire had no idea what he was sitting on." She felt her own face do nothing. Absolute nothing. Controlled. Correct. Beside her, Minister Calvert's wife was saying something about the land reform proposals, and Vivienne returned her attention there, to the conversation that was actually happening, to the people actually in front of her. But something had shifted in the room's temperature, in the way the evening was now moving, and she understood, with the clinical clarity that the last 5 years had refined in her, that whatever she had built tonight, whatever she had become in this ballroom in the space of 4 hours, could not be unbuilt. It was out there now in the room's collective awareness, like heat from a fire, and there was no taking it back, and no part of her wanted to. She was also aware, with a precision that she couldn't have explained but couldn't deny, that somewhere in this ballroom Cedric Ravenshire was standing very still in a way that had nothing to do with the stillness of a man at ease. And she had one single, cold thought, clean as winter air. He was beginning to understand what he had thrown away. The music started again. Crown Prince Adrian Vale appeared at her elbow and said quietly, for her alone, The king has noticed you. He's asked to be introduced." She set down her empty glass and turned toward the center of the room, where King Aldrich III stood in a small clearing of deference that powerful men always occupied, surrounded by his court, and watching her with the sharp, unhurried assessment of someone who had spent 40 years evaluating people and rarely needed long to form a view. King Aldrich III. Not a minister, not a lord, not even the crown prince who had already remade the geometry of her evening, the king himself. Behind her, somewhere in the room, she heard the conversation near Cedric's position go abruptly silent. She walked forward, and there was no going back from this. Not for her, not for him, not for the 5 years of silence that were about to discover exactly what they had cost. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings depicted are products of the imagination and bear no relation to real persons or actual events. King Aldrich III was shorter than portraits suggested. This was the first thing Vivian registered as Adrian Vale brought her into the small clearing of deference that surrounded the king. Not the crown, which he wasn't wearing tonight, not the decorations of his rank, but the man himself. Compact and sharp-eyed at 62, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent 4 decades in rooms where everyone was performing for him, and had long since stopped being interested in the performance. He looked at her the way he apparently looked at everything, directly, without the social lubricant of preliminary pleasantry, as though he'd calculated that his position exempted him from the opening moves and wanted to get to whatever was actually there. "Duchess Ravenshire," he said. "Your Majesty," she said, and curtsied with the correct depth, held it the correct duration, rose with the composure she'd spent the last 4 hours building into something load-bearing. "My son tells me you submitted a legal brief to the Duchy magistrate last week regarding the Halmer Mill dispute." "A preliminary brief," she said. "The full submission is pending additional survey data." "From 1808, the king said. She held his gaze. "The property records have gaps. Filling them accurately matters for the precedent." He studied her for a moment with that flat, assessing look. Then something shifted in it. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the expression of a man updating a prior assessment. "Your husband," he said, "has been before my council 3 times this year on matters of duchy administration." "I know," she said. "He didn't mention you." "No," she said. "He wouldn't have." The king looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "The Marchwater connection in the mill dispute. You're aware of it." "I'm aware of it." "And you submitted anyway." "The law supports the farmer's position," she said. "Political connections don't change the survey data." Something moved across the king's face that might, in a younger or less controlled man, have become a smile. "No," he said. "They don't." He glanced at his son briefly, the glance of a man checking something he'd been told against what he was now seeing, and apparently finding the comparison favorable. Then back to her. "We'll speak again, Duchess." It was a dismissal and a promise simultaneously, and she took both correctly and withdrew, and Adrian fell into step beside her for the first 3 paces before the gravity of his own obligations pulled him toward a cluster of waiting ministers, and she was alone again in the room. Alone and entirely different from the woman who had walked into it 3 hours ago. She accepted another glass of champagne she didn't intend to drink, and stood for a moment at the edge of the floor and let herself feel, briefly and without permission, the full weight of what had just happened. Not triumph. She was too careful for triumph, had learned over years that triumph was the emotion that made you stop watching. Something quieter than that. A kind of confirmation. The sense of a thing being proven that you'd known was true, but had never had the external evidence for. She was capable of this. She had always been capable of this. The room had just agreed. She was still holding that feeling, turning it over with the careful attention of someone handling something fragile, when she heard Cedric's voice directly behind her. "You spoke with the king." She turned. He was closer than she'd expected. Close enough that in a different context, a different 5 years, the proximity might have meant something. His face was doing the controlled, managed thing, but underneath the management there was something pressurized, something that had been building for the last 3 hours and was now running out of container. "He approached me," she said. Through the Crown Prince. I know how it happened. His voice was even. The evenness was doing a lot of work. What did he say to you? We spoke about the Halmer water rights case. Cedric was quiet for a moment. His eyes were doing something she'd rarely seen them do, moving, not in the restless way of a man avoiding, but in the fast, internal way of someone running calculations that weren't adding up the way they should. The Halmer case, he said. Yes. You've been working a legal dispute involving the Halmer estate. For 14 months, she said. I mentioned it to you in the corridor 3 weeks ago. You said a water rights matter. You didn't say Halmer. You didn't ask. The silence between them had a new texture. Not the managed, familiar silence of 5 years of parallel lives. Something rawer than that. Something with edges. Lord Halmer, Cedric said, and his voice had dropped into a register she didn't have a prior record of, is a member of the High Council. His brother-in-law is connected to the Marchwater territory. I know who Lord Halmer is, she said. Then you know that a dispute involving his estate, submitted to the magistrate's office without going through the duchy's legal channels, without any consultation with my office. He stopped. Do you understand what that looks like? It looks like a legal brief, she said, correctly submitted, on behalf of 2 tenant farmers with a legitimate grievance. It looks like the Duchess of Ravenshire operating independently in a matter with High Council implications and not telling her husband. His voice was still even. That was almost worse than if it hadn't been. That's not a minor thing, Vivian. She looked at him. She felt the cold, refined anger from earlier sitting exactly where she'd stored it, in good condition, ready. No, she said, it's not. He waited for the rest. When it didn't come immediately, something shifted in his posture. An almost imperceptible tightening, the physical language of a man who has just understood that he is not in the conversation he thought he was in. In 14 months, she said, you did not ask me a single question about how I was spending my time. In 5 years, you have not asked me what I was reading, what I was working on, what I cared about, what I knew. You made it comprehensively clear that the duchy was your affair and that I was not required to have opinions about it. She kept her voice low and clean. So I worked on it quietly, without involving you, because you had already communicated that my involvement was not desired. And now that it has consequences you didn't anticipate, you're concerned about appearances. He was very still. That's not, he started. If you tell me that's not what you meant, she said, I'll need you to explain what you did mean, precisely, because I have very good records of what was communicated. The room around them continued its noise and light. Nobody was watching this exact exchange. It looked, from a distance, like a husband and wife in brief, unremarkable conversation. She was aware of that, and she was aware that Cedric was aware of it, and the gap between what it looked like and what it was had a particular quality that she was going to have to deal with later, when she was somewhere quieter. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she still didn't have a full category for. Then he said, very quietly, We need to talk. Yes, she said. We do. She turned back toward the room. But not here. She was at the far end of the north gallery 20 minutes later when Thomas appeared. Not Cedric. Thomas. She registered this as she registered everything tonight. Precisely, with the full attention of someone who had learned that information arrived in the packaging of small details. Thomas in the North Gallery, at this hour, at a court function, meant Cedric had sent him, which meant Cedric had needed to send him rather than coming himself, which meant something had interrupted whatever was happening between them. Thomas's face was doing the thing it did when he was carrying news that he found personally distressing but professionally required him to deliver without distress. Your Grace, he said, there's a matter. What matter? He glanced once, briefly, at the nearest cluster of guests. Far enough away, the ambient noise sufficient. Lord Hartley has arrived, within the last quarter hour. A pause. With Lady Prescott. Vivian looked at him. Lady Prescott was the widow of the late Earl of Prescott, a woman of 40, handsome and clever and socially precise, who moved through the court with the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly what she was doing and having done it for a long time. Vivian knew of her the way she knew of most things. Through the accumulated material of observation and correspondence, the picture assembled from pieces rather than direct exposure. She knew that Lady Prescott had been, in the second year of their marriage, the subject of a rumor that Vivian had categorized and filed and not thought about in 3 years. She thought about it now. "Where is my husband?" she said. "He went to meet Lord Hartley when word came that he'd arrived," Thomas said. "He asked me to—" A pause. "He asked me to find you and suggest you might prefer to retire to the carriage for the remainder of the evening." The sentence arrived and sat. Vivian looked at Thomas, who looked back at her with the focused neutrality of a man who had served this household for 11 years and had, in that time, developed a relationship with his own moral position that required him to deliver this message and simultaneously make clear, through the architecture of his delivery, that he found it unconscionable. "He asked you," she said, "to suggest I retire to the carriage." "Those were his words, Your Grace." She was aware of her own breathing, steady, controlled, the inhale and exhale of a woman who had spent 5 years learning to regulate her physical responses to information she didn't want. She was aware of the champagne glass in her hand and the music from the ballroom down the corridor and the cold pressure of the night outside the gallery windows. She had just spoken with the king. She had danced the first set with the crown prince. She had been told by Lord Alderton's carrying voice that Cedric had no idea what he was sitting on. She had felt for the first time in 5 years the specific and irreversible sensation of being seen, and Cedric had sent his butler to ask her to wait in the carriage. The anger she'd been storing with such precision did something she hadn't prepared for. It went very quiet. Not gone. Quieter than gone. The kind of quiet that comes when something stops being a feeling and becomes a fact. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "That will be all." He withdrew. She stood in the gallery for a moment, alone with the portraits of previous monarchs and the distant music and the particular quality of this moment, the way it was simultaneously the last thing she would have predicted and the only thing she now understood that could have been inevitable. He had sent Thomas. At this ball, in this evening, after the king and the crown prince and 14 months of work that had finally become visible, Cedric had sent Thomas to ask her to wait in the carriage because Lord Hartley had arrived with Lady Prescott, and Cedric apparently needed to manage that situation without the variable of his wife in the room. She set her champagne glass on the narrow table beside the nearest portrait and looked at the painting. Some previous king, 17th century, heavy in the jowls and certain in the eyes. And she thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, about what she was going to do next. Not about what she felt. She would attend to that later, in the East Library, with the candles burning and the frost on the windows and all the time in the world. What she was going to do. She was not going to the carriage. She found them in the blue anteroom off the east corridor, which was technically a private space, but which at court functions occasionally absorbed guests who needed to be away from the main rooms. Lord Hartley she knew slightly. A man of 50, political, with the smooth surface of someone who'd spent decades at court and had learned to present exactly what each room required. Lady Prescott was beside him, in green silk, with the composed expression of a woman who had calculated the geometry of the evening and was comfortable with her position in it. Cedric was standing with his back half to the door when she entered. He turned. His face did something complicated and then went very still. "Vivienne," he said. "Cedric," she said. She looked at Lord Hartley and Lady Prescott with the pleasant, level expression she'd perfected. "Lord Hartley, Lady Prescott." "Duchess Ravenshire." Hartley's voice was smooth. Whatever he'd expected tonight, she could see him rapidly recalculating. An unexpected pleasure. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. She looked at Cedric. "I didn't want to wait in the carriage." The sentence was quiet and precise, and it landed in the room with the exact weight she'd intended, which was the weight of everything it didn't say. Cedric's jaw did the thing. Lady Prescott looked at her champagne glass with the studied attention of a woman removing herself from a situation she'd correctly identified as dangerous. "We were just—" Hartley started. "I'm sure you were," Vivian said. "Please don't let me interrupt." She moved to stand beside Cedric with the easy, natural precision of a woman who had decided in the gallery 30 seconds ago that the rules of the last 5 years were no longer operational. Close enough that the room read them as a unit. Close enough that the alternative reading, the one Cedric had apparently been managing, became more difficult. She felt him go rigid beside her. Not dramatic, just the particular quality of a man who has just understood that a situation he thought he was controlling has left his hands. Lady Prescott looked up from her champagne glass and looked at Vivian, and whatever she saw there, the steadiness of it, the specific quality of a woman who has just decided something and has no further room for ambiguity, made her set the glass down and say, very correctly, "I believe I promised Lady Whitford a conversation earlier, if you'll excuse me." She left. Hartley, reading the room with the efficiency of a long-practiced court animal, found something he needed to attend to in the main ballroom and was gone 30 seconds later. Vivian and Cedric were alone in the blue anteroom. The music from the ballroom was muffled through 2 closed doors. The room was lit by 6 candles in a wall sconce and the faint reflection of the winter night through the single window. Cedric was looking at her with an expression that had nothing managed about it anymore. The wall was down, or a section of it, the section that had apparently required more maintenance than he had available tonight. "You should not have come in here," he said. "You shouldn't have sent Thomas," she said. The silence, a different kind from all the prior ones, something stripped of its careful dressing. "Lady Prescott is—" he started. "I don't want to talk about Lady Prescott," she said. "Then what do you want?" She looked at him. She thought about 5 years. She thought about the East Library and the candles and the letters from people who had written to her by accident and kept writing back on purpose. She thought about the king's face recalibrating and Adrian Vale saying, "You deserve to be visible," and Thomas's careful, anguished delivery in the gallery. "I want to know," she said, "what you thought was going to happen. Tonight. Long term. Any of it." Her voice was steady, and it was going to stay steady because she had not come this far to let it break here. In this room. In front of him. "Did you think I was going to stay in the East Wing indefinitely? That I was going to keep myself invisible until it was convenient for you to remember I existed? That I was going to wait in the carriage every time something complicated arrived? That's not... because I need you to understand something." She took 1 step toward him, which closed the distance to nothing, and she looked at him from close enough that there was no version of looking away that wouldn't be obvious. "I am not what you've been treating me as. I don't know if you knew that and chose it, or if you simply never looked. But tonight, whatever you knew or didn't know about me, the king knows. The crown prince knows. Half this room knows. And that is not going to unhappen, because you send Thomas to ask me to wait in the carriage." He was very still. She could see the thing in his face that she'd been catching at the edges all evening. The raw, unmapped territory of a man encountering an outcome he hadn't modeled. "I know that," he said. It came out different from his usual register. Lower. Less processed. "Then you also know," she said, "that we are past the point where I accept your absence as my condition." He said nothing. She held his gaze and let the silence do what it needed to do. And then from the direction of the main ballroom, through the 2 closed doors and the muffled music, she heard a voice she recognized as Lord Alderton's, raised, which Alderton never raised his voice, carrying the specific high tension of a man delivering news that couldn't wait for a private moment. And then she heard, clearly enough to stop her own breathing. "The Halmer brief. Ravenshire. They're saying your wife submitted it in coordination with the Crown Prince's office. That it was planned. That she's been working with Vale's people for months." The silence in the anteroom was absolute. Vivian looked at Cedric. Cedric looked at her. And she watched the moment happen, watched something in his face do the thing that betrayed exactly where his mind went first, in the half-second before he could manage it, in the unguarded instant before the wall came back up. Not, "That's not true." Not, "I know you wouldn't do that." The flicker of a man who, in the first instant, didn't know, who had to think about it. She felt it land in her chest with the specific weight of something that could not be unfelt. The precise and irreversible understanding that in 5 years she had built a life, a body of work, a self, and the man she was married to had been so absent from all of it that when a lie arrived wearing its clothing, He couldn't immediately tell the difference. She had 1 second to decide what to do with that. "It's not true," she said. Her voice was a different kind of steady now. Not the controlled steadiness of managed anger, but the steadiness of someone who has just understood the full geometry of a situation and is choosing, without the luxury of time, who they're going to be inside it. Cedric's face had closed back up, but she'd seen it. He knew she'd seen it. "I know," he said. "You hesitated," she said. "Vivian, you hesitated," she said again, and this time it wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact, delivered with the same precision she brought to everything, the same forensic clarity she'd developed in 5 years of needing to see things as they were rather than as she wished them to be. Outside the anteroom, she could hear the shape of the ballroom shifting. Alderton's voice had carried. The kind of rumor it had carried was the kind that moved fast in rooms like this, gathering mass as it moved, and by morning it would have a different shape than it had now, and the shape it would have by morning would require, from her, a response she had approximately 12 hours to determine. She was the Duchess of Ravenshire. She had just spoken with the king. She had 14 months of documented independent legal work with a paper trail that would survive scrutiny. The rumor was false and provably false, and it didn't matter. Except that in this room, right now, the man she'd married had hesitated. And that was the thing she was going to have to decide how to carry. She picked up her wrap from the chair where she'd set it and looked at Cedric one final time. "I'm going back into the ballroom," she said. "You should come. If you don't, the absence will be its own statement." She paused at the door. "I need you to know that I'm not asking for your help with this. I can manage what's out there. But you need to decide tonight what kind of man you're going to be. Because what happens next is going to require you to be one kind or the other, and there's no version of it where you get to be both." She opened the door. The light and sound of the ballroom poured in. She walked into it alone, and the room turned to look at her, and she held their gaze, every single one, and did not look back to see if he was following. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings depicted are products of the imagination and bear no relation to real persons or actual events. What? She walked back into the ballroom alone, and the room received her the way rooms receive people who have just made a decision that shows, not with applause, not with acknowledgement, but with that subtle, animal reorientation of collective attention that happens when someone enters a space carrying something real. The rumor had moved. She could feel its shape in the room already, the way it had distributed itself through the clusters of guests in the minutes she'd been in the anteroom. Not uniformly, but in the specific pattern that court gossip always took. Faster through the political clusters, slower through the social ones, reshaping as it moved, picking up inference and embellishment the way water picks up sediment. By the time it reached the edges of the room, it would be unrecognizable from what Alderton had actually said. But the damage wasn't in the details. The damage was in the activation of doubt, the sudden question mark attached to her name at the precise moment her name had become worth questioning. She understood this with the same clinical precision she brought to water rights surveys and agricultural census data. Rumors at court operated on the same logic as legal precedent. What mattered wasn't the truth of the original claim, but how quickly and firmly it was countered, and by whom, and in what register. She needed Adrian Vale. She found him in 4 minutes, which was faster than she'd expected because he found her first. He appeared at her left shoulder from the direction of the king's cluster, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been watching the room and knew exactly where she'd be when she emerged from the east corridor. And he fell into step beside her with the naturalness of someone resuming a conversation rather than initiating one. "I heard," he said quietly. "How much of it?" "Enough." A pause, 2 steps, the music covering their conversation from the nearest guests. "The sourcing is Hartley. He was in the west corridor when your brief arrived at the magistrate's office last week, and apparently has been sitting on the information until tonight presented an opportune moment." She processed this without breaking stride. Hartley. Lord Halmer's political ally. The man who had been in the anteroom with Lady Prescott when she walked in, and who had, she now recalibrated, not been there by coincidence. "He was waiting," she said. "He was waiting," Adrian confirmed. "The mill dispute has more political weight than a water rights case should. Marchwater's interests run deeper than the survey records. Someone needed to neutralize the brief before it reached full submission, and neutralizing you tonight, when you were newly visible and the court's attention was on you, was considerably more efficient than attacking the legal merits. She felt the architecture of it click into place. 14 months of careful work, submitted last week, and Hartley had held the information like a card until the moment her credibility was worth destroying. Until tonight, when destroying it would cost the most. "They used my visibility against me," she said. "Yes," Adrian said, "which means the visibility was real. You don't deploy a weapon against something that doesn't matter." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were at the edge of the dance floor, the music building toward the end of a set, and around them the room ebbed and flowed with its own business, and she stood in the middle of it and thought. The rumor said she had coordinated with the Crown Prince's office, that the brief was political rather than legal, that she was operating as an instrument of someone else's agenda rather than as an independent actor pursuing a legitimate grievance. Every element was calibrated to undermine exactly what the evening had built. The King's recalibration, Lady Whitford's assessment, the room's genuine surprise at finding substance where it had expected decoration. If the rumor held, she became a different kind of story. Not the forgotten Duchess who had built herself into something remarkable. A woman being used by a crown prince for political purposes, which made the crown prince's attention something to be suspicious of and made her something to be dismissed. "What do you need?" Adrian said. She looked at him. "Your honest position on the Halmer brief, not as a favor, publicly." He didn't hesitate. "I reviewed it through my office's standard oversight function. It's legally sound, and the survey irregularity it identifies is genuine. If it reaches full submission, it will hold." A pause. "I'll say that to anyone in this room who asks." "They'll say you're protecting your investment." "Let them," he said. "The document speaks for itself, and the King has already read the preliminary findings." He looked at her steadily. "Vivian, you did the work. The work is real. That doesn't disappear because Hartley has a mouth and a motive." She nodded once, absorbing this, filing it, moving. "I need to speak to Lady Whitford," she said, "and Lord Pemberton, and I need to do it before the next set begins." "Then go," Adrian said. "I'll handle Hartley." She went. She was 3 minutes into a conversation with Lady Whitford, careful, precise, giving the older woman exactly enough information to draw her own conclusions without being told what to conclude, which was the only kind of persuasion that worked on women like Eleanor Whitford, when she felt the room change. Not dramatically, a shift in the acoustic quality of it, the particular drop in ambient noise that happened when multiple conversations paused simultaneously because something had entered the room's awareness. She felt it in her back, in the sudden alertness of her own body before her mind had processed the cause. She looked up. Cedric had come back into the ballroom. He had not apparently used the time in the anteroom to compose himself in the usual way. He looked, she catalogued this fast, the way she catalogued everything, like a man who had made a decision that cost him something and was moving before he could reconsider it. The careful management was still there in his surface. The posture and bearing of the Duke of Ravenshire were intact, but underneath them was something stripped and purposeful that she had never seen in him before at any court function or in any room of his own house. He was moving toward Lord Hartley. She watched this happen with the focused stillness of someone who understands that what they are observing is not reversible. Cedric crossed the ballroom floor in the particular way of a man who has decided that the social geometries of the room are temporarily irrelevant, cutting through clusters with the quiet authority of his rank. And he reached Hartley in the cluster near the east windows, and the cluster reorganized itself instinctively around the Duke's arrival, the way clusters did, and she could not hear what was said from this distance, but she could read it. Cedric's posture said, "This ends now." Hartley's response, the slight backward shift, the recalibration of his expression, said, "This is not the conversation I planned to have tonight." Lady Whitford, beside Vivian, had gone very still in the way of a woman who has excellent peripheral vision and has just clocked something worth watching. "Well," Lady Whitford said quietly, "that's unexpected." "Yes," Vivian said. "He's dressing down Hartley in front of Pemberton and Voss," Lady Whitford said, her voice carrying the precise neutrality of someone narrating without editorializing. "That's not nothing. Hartley has high council connections." "I know," Vivian said. "Your husband appears not to care about that at the moment." Vivian said nothing. She watched Cedric and felt the complicated, unwelcome thing happening in her chest that she didn't have clean language for. Not forgiveness, not gratitude, not the softening she'd spent 5 years training herself against. Something more complicated and less safe than any of those. The recognition of a man doing something he didn't have to do, in a room where doing it had real cost, for a reason that had nothing to do with political calculation and everything to do with the thing he hadn't been able to say in 5 years of saying nothing. She was not going to let that recognition make her careless. She had been careful too long and at too high a cost to let one ballroom scene reorganize everything. But she noted it, the way she noted everything, with precision and without immediate conclusion. Cedric came to her 20 minutes later. The room had absorbed the Hartley exchange the way rooms absorbed these things, with intense, distributed attention followed by the rapid generation of interpretation, which was still running through the various clusters when Cedric crossed to where she was standing with Pemberton and his wife. And the Pembertons correctly identified the need for a brief withdrawal and found something to attend to elsewhere. He stood in front of her, close. Not as close as the anteroom, but with an intention to it that hadn't been there before. As though the distance he maintained had changed its quality from habit to choice. "What did you say to him?" she said. "I told him the brief was legally submitted under my wife's independent authority as Duchess of Ravenshire," Cedric said. "That any implication of improper coordination was false, and I would personally ensure the Duchy's legal office provided documentation confirming it, and that I would consider any further distribution of the rumor a deliberate act of bad faith toward the House of Ravenshire." She looked at him. "Hartley will not be a problem," he said. "He has high council connections." "He has high council connections," Cedric said, "and I have the high council's ear on 3 active pieces of legislation he needs passed. He did the math." She absorbed this. "You used your political leverage." "Yes." "To protect my legal brief." "To protect my wife," he said, and it landed differently from the same words in the ballroom 3 hours ago. Not possession this time. Something rawer than that. Something that had the quality of a man who had stood in an anteroom for 20 minutes with the specific and undeniable knowledge of what he'd failed at, and had come out the other side of that knowledge and was still standing in it rather than managing it from behind glass. She held his gaze. "That doesn't fix the last 5 years." "I know that," he said. "One conversation with Hartley doesn't—" "I know that," he said again, and the repetition carried more weight than the first instance. The weight of a man who has stopped arguing the perimeter of the thing and is standing at its center. I'm not asking you to consider it fixed. I'm asking you to let me—" He stopped. The jaw tension. The thing underneath the management. He looked away briefly, at some point over her left shoulder, and then back. And when he came back, the management was thinner than she'd ever seen it. "I handled tonight wrong. I handled 5 years wrong. I don't know how to explain it in the middle of a ballroom, and I'm not going to try." A pause. "But I need you to know that what you said in the anteroom about deciding who I'm going to be, I heard it." The music had started again. The room around them was doing its business with the practiced efficiency of people who knew when a conversation was private, even in a public space, and were giving them the courtesy of pretending not to watch, which meant they were all watching. She looked at him for a long moment. "Then we go home," she said, "and we have the conversation there." Something moved across his face that she still didn't have a complete category for, but that she admitted to herself, beginning to build one for. "Yes," he said, dumbed. They found Adrian Vale before they left. Cedric found him, actually, walked directly to where the Crown Prince was standing near the King's cluster, and spoke to him in the brief, direct way of 2 men who didn't know each other well, but had just become temporarily aligned by the same event. She watched from 3 feet away and couldn't hear most of it, but caught the end. Cedric saying something quiet, and Adrian nodding once, and then Cedric extending his hand, which Adrian took, and whatever passed between them in that handshake had the quality of an acknowledgement rather than a pleasantry. Cedric came back to her. "He speaks highly of your work," he said. "I know," she said. He was right to. She looked at her husband and felt the complicated thing in her chest again, that unwelcome, unresolved thing that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, but something that existed in the space between them that she hadn't, until tonight, believed had space in it at all. They collected their coats. Thomas materialized with the efficiency of long practice, and she caught his face for just a moment. The expression he wore when something had shifted in the household's interior weather. And he met her eyes for precisely long enough to communicate that he'd seen the Hartley exchange and had opinions about it that he would not be sharing. The carriage again. The winter dark. The city receding as the horses found the road to Ravenshire Hall. This silence was different from the one on the way in. Not comfortable. Too much had happened for comfort, and she was honest enough with herself to know that one evening, however extraordinary, did not undo what 5 years had constructed. But something in it was permeable. Something that the earlier silence hadn't been. Cedric was looking at his hands. "The hesitation," he said. "In the anteroom." She waited. "You saw it," he said. "Yes." "I need you to understand." He stopped. He tried again. "I didn't doubt you. Not genuinely. It was less than a second, and it wasn't—" He stopped again. She could see him struggling with the precision of it, which was unusual because Cedric Ravenshire was rarely imprecise with language. "I've spent 5 years not knowing you. What I know of you is, I built an impression from the outside, from what I could see. And what I could see wasn't much because I wasn't looking." He looked up. The light in the carriage was very low, just the faint reflections of the lanterns through the windows, and his face in it was unguarded in a way that she thought probably had no name in his own vocabulary, a thing that had never needed a name before because it had never been seen. "When Alderton said it, for that half second, what I felt wasn't doubt in you. It was the recognition that I wouldn't know, that I had constructed a situation where I genuinely wouldn't know what you were capable of or who you were doing it with because I had refused systematically to find out." The carriage moved through the winter dark. "That's more honest than I expected," she said. "I'm trying," he said, and it was the most unarmored thing she'd heard him say in 5 years, possibly ever, and it landed in the carriage between them with the specific gravity of something that had cost its speaker exactly what it looked like it cost. She looked out the window. The oaks were coming into view, the frost-hardened approach to Ravenshire Hall, the stone facade emerging from the winter dark with all its windows dark, except the entrance lanterns that Thomas must have left burning. She thought about the East Library, the candles, the letters, the years of becoming someone in a house where nobody was watching. She thought about what he'd said. "I wouldn't know." And the fact that he had said it to her face in a moving carriage with nowhere to go and nothing to manage it with. "We're going to have a long conversation," she said. "I know," he said. "It's not going to be comfortable." "I know that too." The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. The cold December air came in, sharp and clean, and she stepped out onto the gravel of Ravenshire Hall's entrance and stood for a moment in the winter dark, looking at the house that had been her silence for 5 years, and thought about what it was going to have to become now. Cedric stepped out beside her. And then from inside the house, from behind the closed front doors, from somewhere in the interior that should have been empty of everyone except the skeleton nightstaff, they heard voices. More than one. Male. The particular register of men trying to keep their voices low and failing because the information they were carrying was too large for quiet. Thomas opened the front door from the inside before they reached it, and his face was doing something she'd never seen it do before in 11 years of watching Thomas's face. Something that stripped away every layer of professional composure and left underneath it the raw, specific expression of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have. "Your Grace," he said, and he was looking at Cedric, not at her. "Lord Alderton's man arrived 20 minutes ago. There's a document. It was delivered to the Duchy legal office this evening while you were at the ball." He paused, and in the pause she heard everything that was coming before he said it. "It's a formal complaint, filed with the High Council, against the Duchess." The cold air moved through the entrance hall. "On what grounds?" Cedric said. His voice was the controlled, even register, but underneath it, something had gone very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. The stillness of a man who has just felt the ground shift and is assessing the damage before he moves. Thomas looked at the paper in his hands. Improper conduct unbecoming a duchy title, unauthorized legal practice, and another pause, shorter this time, like a man who has decided the fastest delivery is the cleanest. Conspiracy with the Crown Prince's office to manipulate duchy legal proceedings for political benefit. The entrance hall of Ravenshire Hall was very quiet. Vivian stood in the cold December air with the weight of the evening on her. The king's recalibration, the Crown Prince's handshake, the water rights brief, the dance, the anteroom, the carriage, all of it. And she felt the precise and terrible clarity of a moment when everything that has been building converges into a single point. Hartley had not done the math the way Cedric thought he had, or he had done different math entirely. She looked at Cedric. He was looking at the document in Thomas's hands with an expression that had nothing managed about it. Just the raw, stripped face of a man who has just understood that the ground he thought he was standing on does not exist, that the choice he made tonight in that ballroom, the Hartley confrontation and the handshake with the Crown Prince, and the carriage ride home with its halting, unprecedented honesty, had not resolved the crisis. It had escalated it, and the woman standing beside him, the woman he had spent 5 years not knowing, the woman who had built herself into something formidable in a drafty library while he ran his duchy and managed his distance. That woman was now the center of a high council complaint that bore her name and his house's crest and the specific calculated weight of men who had decided that the cleanest way to kill the brief was to kill the person who filed it. He looked at her. She looked at him. And she said very quietly, the only thing there was to say, "Now we find out. Now we find out." The words hung in the entrance hall of Ravenshire Hall the way certain sentences hung, not dissolving into the air but staying, taking up residence, becoming part of the structure of the moment. Thomas stood with the document in his hands, and the night staff waited at the periphery of the lamplight, and the cold December air moved through the open door that nobody had yet closed, and Cedric looked at his wife and understood, with the specific and unsparing clarity that comes to men who have spent their lives avoiding clarity, exactly what she meant. Not, now we find out if we survive this. Now we find out who you are. He took the document from Thomas. Read it. His face did the controlled thing, the management, but she was close enough now, had been paying close enough attention for long enough, to see underneath the management to where the thing was actually happening, which was somewhere in the region of a man who has just been handed the precise consequence of every choice he made over 5 years and cannot, for the first time, find a way to root around it. "Close the door," he said to Thomas. "Send the night staff to their quarters. Nobody speaks to anyone outside this house about this document until I say otherwise." "Yes, Your Grace," Thomas said, and his voice carried the particular quality it carried when he approved of an instruction. The door closed. The cold stayed in the hall for a moment longer, then began to recede. Cedric lowered the document and looked at her. "Hartley didn't go home and do the math," he said. "He went home and made a call." "Yes," she said. This was already prepared. He looked at the paper again. "The language is too clean. This took days, maybe longer." He looked up. "He was waiting for tonight specifically, for your visibility, for the moment when a complaint against you would have the most surface area." She had already reached this conclusion in the 30 seconds since Thomas had read the charges, but she let him arrive at it himself because it mattered. The arriving, the seeing, the specific and unmanaged recognition on his face that this was not an improvised attack but a calibrated one, which meant it had been in motion for weeks, which meant that while she had been building the brief and he had been running the duchy's political relationships, someone in those relationships had been watching her and waiting. "Marchwater's people," she said. "Not just Hartley." "Hartley is the instrument," Cedric said. "Marchwater is the hand." He set the document on the entry table. "The mill dispute. If the brief holds and the survey irregularity is confirmed, Marchwater loses the water rights argument and potentially faces retroactive liability for 18 months of illegal diversion. That's not a minor financial exposure." He paused. I should have seen this coming. The sentence arrived without performance. No qualification, no redirect. Just the flat statement of a man assessing his own failure at its actual dimensions. You didn't know about the brief, she said. I should have known about the brief, he said. I should have known about all of it. The Athenaeum correspondence, the endowment proposal, the 14 months of work happening in my own house that I was too... He stopped. The jaw tension. He pushed through it. Too absent to see. The entrance hall was very quiet. The lamps burned with the steady, unperturbed quality of objects indifferent to human drama. She looked at her husband and thought about the long conversation she'd told him they were going to have, the one she'd warned would not be comfortable, and understood that they were having it now, not in the controlled circumstances she'd imagined, not sitting across from each other in the morning room with tea going cold between them. Here, in the entrance hall, in their court clothes, with the High Council complaint on the entry table and the night still cold in the walls. Come to the library, she said. Not his library, the East Library. She didn't have to specify which one. He followed her. She lit the lamps herself, the way she always did, without waiting for staff. The East Library received them with its familiar smell of old paper and beeswax, and the particular dusty warmth of a room that was used regularly and cared about. She moved to her desk, and he stood in the middle of the room, the same way he'd stood in her sitting room months ago, in the doorway, not quite committing, except that tonight he came fully inside and stood in the room properly, which was a different thing. He looked at the shelves, the working files in their cabinet, the stack of ongoing correspondence, the monograph on irrigation that she still hadn't finished annotating. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man seeing a country he hadn't known existed inside his own borders. You built all of this, he said. Yes. In here, in this room. Mostly, she said, some of it in the garden, some in letters, 4 years of it before you noticed there was anything to notice. He absorbed this. He didn't flinch from it, which she registered. Tell me what you need to fight this complaint, he said. Specifically, what documents, what precedents, what witnesses. I have the full correspondence with the Athenaeum that establishes the independent legal basis of the work. I have the submission records from the magistrate's office. I have Professor Whitmore's academic endorsement of the agricultural survey methodology. She paused. And I have 14 months of documented work product that will survive any scrutiny the High Council applies to it, because every piece of it is accurate. Adrian will confirm the Crown Prince's office's interaction with the brief was standard oversight review, Cedric said. I'll get that in writing before morning. He looked at her. And I'll go before the High Council myself. She looked at him. That's significant. That's you putting the Duchy's credibility behind mine. It is, he said. If the complaint holds anyway, if Marchwater's connections run deeper than your leverage, then we deal with that, he said, together. But I'm not going to manage my exposure while yours is unaddressed. That's not... He stopped again. The stopping was different from the way he used to stop, she noticed. Not suppression, searching. The difference between a man who stopped because he didn't want to say the thing and a man who stopped because he was trying to say the thing correctly. That's not what a husband does. The lamp on her desk burned with its steady, patient light. She sat down, not at the desk, in the chair beside it, the one she used for reading, the one that had the permanent slight depression from years of her weight in it. She sat and she looked at him standing in the middle of her library, and she thought about what she was going to say, what the years entitled her to say, and how much of it she was actually going to say tonight versus carry to the longer conversation. Sit down, she said. He sat. The chair across from hers, the one that had held almost no previous occupant. He sat in it with the careful quality of a large man trying not to impose himself on a space he hadn't earned, and she noticed that too, filed it alongside everything else. I need you to tell me, she said, why? The real reason, not the management version, not the version that makes it a rational choice or a considered position. She held his gaze. Why you kept your distance for 5 years? The lamp burned. Because my father, he said, was a man who used proximity as a weapon. She had not expected that opening. She waited. He had complete command of every room he entered, of everyone in it, including my mother. He looked at his hands. She had never seen him look at his hands before, as though they were something separate from him that he was checking on. He was not a violent man. He was something I think is worse than violent, which is precise. He knew exactly what to say and exactly when to say it, and he used that precision the way a surgeon uses a blade to open things up in ways that didn't close correctly. A pause. I watched him do it to my mother for 20 years, and I watched her diminish, not all at once, the way things diminish when something essential is drawn off slowly. The room was very quiet. When our marriage was arranged, he said, I was 26. I had spent 26 years watching what happened when a man like my father was fully present in the life of a woman who hadn't chosen him. He looked up. I told myself I was protecting you, that the distance was a kind of mercy, that if I stayed out of your life, you'd have room to exist in it without my particular inheritance doing damage. She looked at him for a long time. That, she said carefully, is one of the most sophisticated rationalizations I've encountered. He held her gaze. I know. You were protecting yourself, she said, from the possibility of becoming him, and you built a story around it that made the distance a gift instead of a failure. The sentence arrived and he took it without flinching. Yes, he said, that's more accurate. You robbed me of a marriage, she said. Not angry, just precise. The same precision she brought to everything, the water rights surveys and the census data and the years of careful documentation of her own interior life. You decided, without asking me, that I was better served by your absence than your presence. You made that choice for both of us, and you called it consideration. Yes, he said again, and the word was carrying more weight each time he said it, the accumulated weight of a man who has stopped trying to distribute the load more evenly and is letting it sit where it belongs. I spent 5 years, she said, becoming someone in a house where nobody was watching. And I am. I'm grateful for who I became. I would not trade the East Library or the letters or the work. But I built all of that in the space your absence made, Cedric, and I built it alone. And there is a cost to that kind of aloneness that I'm not going to pretend doesn't exist just because the product of it turned out to be something worth having. He was quiet for a long time. I know, he said, and then, I saw it tonight, the king's face when he spoke to you, Adrian Vale's, the way he looked at you, not as a political consideration, but as someone he genuinely respected. The room, when you walk back into it after the anteroom. He paused. You built something real, and I had nothing to do with it. And I sat in that ballroom for 3 hours understanding that my wife had become someone extraordinary, and I was the last person in the room to know it. And the reason I was the last to know it was because I had arranged things so that I would be. The lamp on the desk guttered slightly in a draft from the old window, then steadied. What do you want? She said. From this point, not what you think you should want, what you actually want. He looked at her with the unguarded face, the one she'd been catching edges of all evening, the one that existed under the management and that she was beginning to understand was the real face, the one his control had been protecting not her from, but him. I want to know you, he said. I want to know who you are, the work, the correspondence, the woman who corrected Hartley at dinner 3 years ago and who I told to stay in her lane. He paused. I want to be in the same house in the actual sense rather than the administrative one. That's going to require you to be uncomfortable, she said, regularly. I have opinions, and I will not stop having them because they complicate your political arrangements. I know that. I'm going to continue the water rights work, and the endowment proposal, and the correspondence with the Athenaeum, and whatever comes after those things, because this is not a woman who stops having intellectual life because her husband has decided he'd like to be present for it. I know that too, he said. And if you ever send Thomas to ask me to wait in the carriage again, she said, I will make sure that you spend the rest of your life understanding exactly why that was the wrong choice. Something happened in his face. Not a smile. Too much had passed for the ease of a smile. But something in the same territory, something that arrived and was genuine and was the expression of a man who was, for what might be the first time, in contact with the person across from him. Yes, he said, I believe you.
I said.
They worked through the night, not talking, or not only talking. The complaint required a response within 72 hours under High Council rules, and the response required documentation and legal framing and the kind of precise, methodical construction that Vivian had spent 14 months building the muscles for. She pulled the relevant files. He went through them with a focus that surprised her. Not the political instinct, not the management, but genuine attention to the material, to the survey data, and the legal precedent and the specific language of the Marchmont ruling that underpinned everything. At 2 a.m, he said, without looking up from the 1847 documentation, "This is good work." "I know," she said. "The survey analysis in Section 4. Whitmore's methodology." He turned a page. "This is better than anything my legal office has produced in 3 years." She said nothing, but she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the approval, she didn't need his approval, but the seeing. The specific quality of being seen doing the work by someone who understood what the work was. At 4 a.m, Thomas appeared in the doorway with tea that nobody had requested and set it down without comment and withdrew. At 5, with the first gray of December light beginning in the tall windows, they had the framework of a response that would hold. Cedric sent a message through the night dispatch to Adrian Vale's residence, brief and specific. Documentation confirming standard oversight review needed before the High Council session. Adrian's response arrived at 6:15, comprehensive, precisely worded, and carrying the weight of the Crown Prince's office in every line. Vivienne read it and set it down and looked at the growing light in the east garden. The frost, the bare oaks, the stone fountain that hadn't run in 2 years, and felt the specific quality of a night that has been gotten through. Not won, not resolved. Gotten through, which was its own kind of thing, its own kind of solid ground. "You should sleep," Cedric said. "So should you." "I have a council member to visit at 7, he said. "Pemberton. His wife spoke to you last night. He owes me a conversation." She looked at him. He was in his court clothes still, jacket off, the controlled precision of his usual presentation worn down to something more basic and more honest. A man who had been up all night doing hard work and looked exactly like that. "You're going to pull every piece of leverage you have," she said. "Yes," he said. "Not just for the complaint, for the mill case." "For both," he said. "The complaint is Marchwater trying to kill the brief by killing your credibility. The answer to the complaint is making the brief unassailable. They're the same fight." She looked at him for a moment. "You understand the case now?" "I spent 4 hours reading your files," he said. "I understand the case." She stood. The East Garden was coming into its winter morning slowly, the light building without warmth but with clarity, the kind of December morning that showed you everything exactly as it was. She stood at the window and looked at it and thought about 5 years of looking at this garden alone. "Cedric," she said. He came to stand beside her, not touching, close enough that she was aware of his warmth, the solid reality of him, the person who had been in this house for 5 years and had been, until last night, an administrative fact rather than a presence. "The fountain," she said. He looked at it. "You had them stop running it," she said, "because the sound interfered with your correspondence." A pause. "I remember. I would like it running again," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll have the groundskeeper see to it today." She nodded. She stood at the window with the winter light coming in and felt the thing in her chest that had been complicated and unwelcome since the ballroom settling into something she could name now. Something that had the specific weight of a decision rather than a feeling. Not the softening she'd trained herself against. Not the desperate hope of a younger woman who had wanted arrival and gotten absence. Something harder won than either of those. The choice to look at what was actually here, in this room, in this man who had come to her library and sat in the chair across from hers and said, "I want to know you," and decide what to build with it, not what she'd lost. What was here? "I'm going to go change," she said, "and then I'm going to sleep for 3 hours, and then we're going to the council together." He turned to look at her. "Together." "Together," she said. "You handle Pemberton. I'll handle the documentation. We present as a unit because that is what we are. and because Marchwater's entire strategy depends on the idea that there is space between us to drive a complaint through. We close that space. Something settled in his face, the thing underneath the management, present and steady. All right, he said. She moved toward the door. He was behind her. Vivian, he said. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the East Library in the gray December light, in yesterday's clothes, with everything that the night had cost both of them visible on him. The tiredness, the stripped-back quality, the specific expression of a man who has been through something that has changed the shape of what he is, and knows it, and is not trying to manage it back into the previous form. I'm sorry, he said, for the 5 years. I know it doesn't cover the territory, but I need you to know that I understand what I did, not my version of it, what it actually was. She held his gaze across the length of the library, across the shelves and the files, and the 4 years of work and the 2 chairs that had one of them sitting in it for the first time last night. I know, she said. We'll build from here. She left the room. He stood in it for a moment longer, alone in the space she'd made over years of being left alone, and she didn't look back, but she heard him, after a moment, follow. The High Council session was 3 days later. Cedric appeared before them with the documentation in one hand and Vivian on his arm, and the combination communicated everything it needed to communicate before a word was spoken. Pemberton had been persuaded. 2 other council members had been briefed. Adrian Vale submitted the Crown Prince's office's written confirmation the morning of the session, hand-delivered, carrying the kind of institutional weight that made certain conversations unnecessary. The complaint was reviewed. The documentation was examined. The survey evidence was presented by Vivian herself, directly, in the council chamber, in the level and precise voice of a woman who had spent 14 months building something that could survive exactly this kind of scrutiny and knew it. Lord Hartley said very little. The Marchwater representative said slightly more and achieved less. The complaint was dismissed. The water rights brief was formally submitted to the Duchy magistrate the following week, with the council's tacit acknowledgement that the legal merits were sound. The mill dispute would take another year to fully resolve. These things always did. But the outcome was no longer in genuine doubt, and everyone in the relevant rooms understood that. She and Cedric walked out of the council chamber into the winter afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment in the cold, clear light, and she felt the specific and quiet satisfaction of a thing completed. Not the end of something, but the resolution of it, the moment when a piece of work arrives at the form it was always moving toward. Well, she said. Yes, he said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked to the carriage. Gut. The following months moved with the particular quality of things being rebuilt. Not the fast, dramatic quality of crisis, but the slow, daily, unglamorous quality of 2 people deciding to actually inhabit their shared life and doing the small, consistent work that required. It was not easy. She had warned him it wouldn't be, and she had been right, and he had, to his credit, not pretended otherwise. There were conversations that were hard. There were evenings when the old habits of distance reasserted themselves, his tendency to manage rather than feel, her tendency to seal rather than reach. And they had to recognize those habits for what they were and choose differently. And sometimes they chose wrong and had to come back to it the next day or the next week and try again. He came to the East Library, not always, not intrusively, but consistently. Appearing in the doorway sometimes with his own reading, sitting in the chair across from hers with the quality of a man who has decided that proximity is not the same as intrusion. She showed him the work. Not because she needed his approval, but because the sharing itself was something she'd been denied long enough that the offering of it was its own kind of choice. He told her things. About his father, more than he'd told her in the entrance hall. Not in a single conversation, but in the accumulated disclosure of ordinary evenings, the way people tell each other things when they are in the same room often enough that telling becomes possible. She listened. She understood things she hadn't understood before. Not as excuses, but as explanations. The difference between the two being the difference between the thing letting him off the hook and the thing helping her see the full architecture of what had happened between them. She did not pretend that understanding was the same as healing. Healing was slower than understanding and more specific, and happened in different chambers of a person at different rates, and she was honest with herself about where she was in it at any given time. some days further along than others. Some mornings at the east window feeling the particular weight of 5 years still sitting in her chest in a way that no conversation, however honest, had fully lifted. But she was not alone in the house anymore. The fountain ran. She heard it in the mornings before she came downstairs, the particular sound of water moving over stone, and she thought every time she heard it about the small specific weight of a request made and a response given, and what it meant when a man whose entire architecture had been built around control and distance said yes to the fountain without negotiation or qualification. Adrian Vale visited in the spring. He came for a political reason. There were ongoing discussions about the duchy's position on a piece of Northern Territory legislation. But he stayed for dinner, and the dinner became one of those evenings that arrived seeming ordinary and revealed itself to be something else. The three of them sat at the table in the main dining room that Vivian had not used for formal dinners in 4 years, and the conversation moved with the ease of people who had been through something together and come out the other side of it with a particular kind of trust. At the end of the evening, on the steps, Adrian looked at them, at Cedric, and then at Vivian, and then at the two of them together, with the expression of someone confirming something he'd hoped for but hadn't been entirely certain of. "You look different," he said to her. "It's been 6 months," she said. "Not time," he said. "Something else." He looked at Cedric. "You both do." Cedric said nothing, but there was something in his silence that had never been in his silences before. Not the managed nothing of a man withholding himself, but the full, present quiet of a man who was simply there, in the moment, in the company, in the life he was standing in. Adrian shook his hand at the carriage and squeezed her hand briefly and said, quietly, for her alone, "You deserved this. From the beginning." She thought about that after he'd gone, standing in the doorway of Ravenshire Hall with the spring evening coming in, the grounds beginning to show green at their edges, the fountain audible from the east garden. She thought about what deserving meant, whether it was the right frame for it. She decided it wasn't quite, not because she hadn't deserved it, but because deserving implied a transactional relationship with life that the last 5 years had disabused her of entirely. You didn't receive what you deserved. You received what you built, what you fought for, what you chose when the choosing was hard, and what remained when everything you'd constructed in the wrong direction had finally finished falling. What she had was not what she'd deserved. It was something she'd survived into, something she'd built out of loss and years of solitude, and the stubborn, unglamorous daily decision to become someone worth being in a drafty library without an audience. That was a different kind of thing from deserving. It was better. The grand winter ball came again 12 months after the first one. They arrived together in the same carriage, in the winter dark, the capital's lights accumulating as they always did on the approach. She wore a different dress this time. Deep burgundy, the color Madame Ardennes had shown her a year ago, the one that caught light and turned it to something close to fire. And Cedric looked at her when she came down the stairs with the expression she had finally, fully built the category for. He saw her. That was all. He simply saw her. In the ballroom, they danced the first set together, not because the Crown Prince asked her, not because something needed to be demonstrated, not because the room was watching and the watching required a response, because the music started and Cedric held out his hand and she took it, and they moved onto the floor together with the particular quality of two people who know each other, who have been through something real and are still standing in each other's vicinity by choice. Around them, the room did what rooms did. Observed, interpreted, generated its assessments. She was aware of it and unbothered by it, which was not a performance of unbotheredness, but the actual thing, the product of having been the subject of the room's attention in far more high-stakes circumstances and having survived it intact. She danced with her husband. The chandeliers threw their light across the floor in shifting patterns, the same chandeliers as last year, the same light. Everything else was different. At some point in the second dance, she looked at him, at the face she had studied for 5 years from the outside and was still learning from the inside, the face that had its management and underneath the management its real terrain, the specific person she was in the process of knowing. And she thought about the East Library, and the candles burning low, and the letters from strangers who became correspondents, and the 2 years of water rights work, and the night they sat across from each other in their court clothes with the lamp burning between them, and the 5 years of silence finally finished being silent. You build from here. That was what she'd said. And here was this: the floor under their feet, the music around them, the winter outside the tall windows, and a man who had learned, at significant cost to both of them, that presence was not the same as danger and proximity was not the same as his father. She was not going to call it an ending. Endings were for stories that finished. This was a thing still in motion: the duchy work, the correspondence, the endowment that had finally been approved under her name rather than a pseudonym, the slow and daily work of two people building something honest out of the ruins of something that had never quite gotten started. All of it still moving, still requiring, still asking something of both of them every day. But the waltz had 3 beats to the bar, and the winter light was coming through the tall windows, and Cedric Ravenshire was looking at her the way he should have been looking at her for 5 years, and she was here, and she was herself. And that was not nothing. That was, she thought, in the quiet and certain voice she used for things she was sure of, everything.